You'd always existed in a reality that ran parallel to my own, and I'd accepted the geometric preset that parallel lines never meet. Éric Chacour, What I Know About You. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. I'm with Ramya Amadhan, of course. Rams, today we're reviewing What I Know About You by Éric Chacour. This thing is a Canadian LGBTQ fiction set in late 20th century Egypt. The plot is pretty much split into two parts. The first part follows Dr. Tarek and his ostracization. I wrote this down. The ostracization from his community for being a gay man in 1980s Cairo. And the second half follows his son, Rafik, about 10 years after, and how he's trying to get back into contact with his essentially completely absent dad. And this thing is an emotionally charged book with a lot of complicated family dynamics. It was originally released in French back in 2023 and ended up being a huge hit in France. And then in 2024 got an English translation. It also did very well here in Canada. What are your first thoughts on this one before we bring on our guests?
It's so heartbreaking. It's so sad. The whole book just felt really poetically miserable, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It wasn't a long read either, 6-ish hours as an audiobook, right? The narration was beautiful, the writing was beautiful, and the story was tragic.
Emotionally very heavy, succinct, pretty straight to the point. It didn't take long to punch you in the face.
Yep. Immediately.
Let's bring on our friends from the Center for Equitable Library Access. Karen McKay is the communications manager at CELA, and Theresa Power is their access librarian. How's it going, guys?
Great. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Here's how I'm thinking we should do this review. Let's basically go point form. I just went through about the general plot of this thing. I want to make sure we get through the points we really want to get out of this book, so whoever might be interested gets what they really need to know. Who wants to go first?
This was Theresa's recommendation, right?
Okay, let's nominate Theresa.
Yeah.
Theresa, you're up.
So I think the first thing I would want to talk about this book, and I think you did a really good job kind of summarizing it, is the narrator. I think the narrator plays such a pivotal role in this book and how the story is conveyed to the reader. And I think to that I would say that I guess perhaps the first thing we would want to say is that the book is divided into 3 different parts, you, me, and us. And I have to say, as a reader, I was truly engrossed in the story that I actually did not clock the second person narrator until I was maybe 2/3 through the book. And I was like, wait a minute,
Really?
It's you. It's been you this entire time. What the heck? I was just so engrossed in the story of this man and this very particular time in history, in Egyptian history, and then how this random encounter turned into this love story. And
right. And just to clarify something really quickly, so Tarek's point of view, the first main character that we follow, his story is told from a second person perspective, whereas the second half of the book that follows Rafik, Tarek's son, is told in first person.
First person, yeah, absolutely.
That's why you're saying you, I, and then us, because it changes perspective in all 3 parts. It's really, really cool.
I mean, I guess you say how the book was broken up, and then the end, the end part of the story is told from his son's point of view. Well, that's, I think, when it really clicked on me. I was like, wait a second. How was this whole story put together for the audience? And he wasn't there when all this was happening with his father, obviously. Can we rely on his interpretation of his father's life? is he a reliable narrator?
But that comes in later, right? Like that question of reliable narrator.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it dawns on the readers, like the story that we've been getting in this where that's all been coming from.
Only when it hits the first person narration do we realize, like, oh, okay, the perspective of. Karen.
So I wasn't sure that the second person narration was going to work. I wasn't as engrossed in the beginning of the story. I thought it was a bit of a slow burn in terms of catching my attention. And I loved the book. I thought it was beautifully written, but I was wondering about whether the second person narration was going to work. And then there's a line partway through the, I guess it's the section where the son is talking about why he's been writing the book, or why he's been writing all of these notes to himself. And it sort of explains, I don't want to give away too much, but it sort of explains his perspective and why he's writing it, and that he realizes that he's not necessarily a reliable narrator. He says something along the lines of, filling in the bits and pieces around his father's life and trying to understand from the various sources that he's received. And that sort of, as a reader, that made me feel more, I don't know, comfortable maybe with the second person narration, less likely to kind of question it, and more to rest in the fact that it was his son's hopes and dreams and impressions and sort of the gathering of all the little bits of his father's life, that it just made it ring more true to me after that section of the book. But I loved it.
This kind of takes me back to like English class 101, because that unreliable narrator is something that we often talked about in what we read, and debated on it. And I mean, I think maybe to Karen's point is that in the end, and by the narrator's own admission, it is a bit unreliable, but maybe it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't really take away from the beauty of the story and what he's trying to tell about his father, and kind of reclaiming in a way like what happened to him, because so much of it was very like cloaks and daggers and nobody really wanted to talk about it. And it's giving a voice to that story and that relationship that he had that was so taboo at that time.
Well, the title of the book is What I Know About You. And if you want to pose that title as a question, what do I know about you? The truth is probably not all that much, to your point. That is probably a bit of an unreliable narrator. And second person narration is really strange in the first place, because first person, it's always, I did this, I did that, this happened to me. Third person is, he did this, she did that. Whereas second person is, you did this, you did that. And it kind of makes the reader question, okay, well, so who is this narrator? And like, what is the relationship to the subject of the story here? Yeah. Much more so than first or third person. It makes you ask questions. And you do get the answer in this book about halfway through.
Well, the thing is, I think we start to understand the bias of who the narrator is and their perspectives on the story, or how they're inserting themselves into their story, only after you find out who the narrator is. Right. And that's why it works so interestingly, because you can kind of backtrack and say, okay, well, how was the story presented to us? I said right off the top that it was just sad. It was tragic. And all those tones and feelings come out because you understand the perspective of the narrator, right? And
of Rafik.
Yeah, of Rafik,
right? Like,
the son.
It's very representative of Rafik's state of mind as it relates to the story.
His own discovery, his own understanding of his father. Like all of you guys have mentioned, this taboo of who his father was, the identity and the place and the setting and everything that kind of wraps this together. There are so many question marks and unknowns still, right? Even after the story ends. But how about how the story is, how the journey is portrayed, like in terms of timeline and the jumping around of, or kind of leaving things at cliffhangers or like jarring points at times, right? There were times when characters would get into some type of friction, or it would be an absolute blowout, and then you're skipping forward, many years.
There's a lot of skipping forward and a little bit of jumping back, but a lot of skipping forward. And that's kind of why this book is so short, because it seems to purposely rip out parts of the story and let you piece together what happened in between, which I really liked. Actually, it didn't drag on. It did make it a little bit of a tough read. You need to make a lot of conclusions and use context clues to figure out what happened. Not exactly the easiest read for that reason, but very concise and straight to the point. The audiobook is about 6.5 hours, by the way. But Corinne or Theresa, did either of you want to comment on this jumping back and forth in time?
I think that the opening part for me, it took me into the end of the book to kind of, or maybe 2/3 of the way through the book, to kind of understand why we started the story when he was a little child. And it's, in a way to kind of set up this expectation that was put on him, in theory, again, because of the narrator, about, this man that he's supposed to be and what he's supposed to do with his life. But I thought that the jumps between time, but especially between places, to also be very interesting, because the way that Egypt is portrayed is so different from the way that Montreal is portrayed in the story. And one is this place where there's so much happening politically, and, landscape-wise is quite different. And, so many things are happening during this particular time period. And then, we go to Montreal, which is a totally different time in his life and a totally different place. It seems so gray and black and white and devoid of, I don't know, like the passion and the color that kind of came along with the descriptions of Cairo and the political fervor that was happening at that time.
And I think part of that is because it's told from the perspective of Rafik, who'd never been to Montreal. And that's how you would describe Canada, as a cold, bleak, politically boring place.
Fair enough. But then, I read those parts about Montreal, and I said to myself, like, I never thought, in the way that the story was given to us and the way that those two places were described to us, that, he would be staying in Montreal. Like, I always thought that he would be going back to Cairo, because Montreal just seems so devoid of everything, of his life, of all these people, of these like strong-headed women who, were in his life and, living with his family and, everything, all those things. Yeah.
I thought the jumping back and forth was interesting, more so for place than for time. I did find it, I wish I'd sort of had a notepad or something beside me so I could have documented where we were. Like, sometimes I thought, okay, where am I in the story?
Right.
But to the point about, the political differences between Egypt and Canada, there's lots of references to what's happening to Egypt throughout the story. But the only really political reference that's made with regards to Canada is the death of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, which I thought was kind of an interesting insertion in the book, because Trudeau, of course, said that the nation has no place in the bedrooms of the citizens. I'm getting that quote wrong, but something along those lines. And so whereas culturally, it was much more difficult for Tariq to exist authentically, I think, in Egypt, because of the cultural taboos and perhaps political taboos. I don't know what the laws are like in Egypt at that time around homosexuality, but I thought that was sort of like an interesting kind of insertion. And I don't know if that speaks to what your point was, Jacob, about it being cold and gray, that, you can exist in a place that allows your love and still not have love, versus the Cairo, which was colorful and beautiful and sensual in ways that the Montreal descriptions are not. And yet, he'd left all of his love back in that place. So that was one of those sort of setting things that, going back to high school English class, was sort of, I thought, was an interesting insertion into the story.
Yeah.
Right. It's sad, because to find a place to live that was accepting of his sexual orientation, his identity, he had to leave his home, right? And he goes to this place that I don't think he ever really finds homely. And he does talk about missing Egypt and living back there. And it's like, he's very nostalgic, and it's where home is for him. And there's kind of a dichotomy there. And we've been pretty light on the details of the plot of the story so far because I'm weary of giving out spoilers because a lot of it's very moment heavy, even in just a 6.5 hour audiobook. But I think from now on, can we talk a little bit about spoilers in the plot? Spoiler warning for anyone. Rems, what did you find to be like some of the most affecting moments in this book?
I truly thought that, and there's so much identity conversation we can have, so much friction in relationships and like beauty of different kind of discoveries and dismissals and recognitions. There's a lot going on. I think the author did so well, but I have to say the romance between Tariq and Ali it was just something so. At the beginning of the story, I didn't know where it would go. I didn't know who was going to be the tougher character, who was going to be the more vulnerable character. I didn't know how dialogue was almost seldom at the beginning, right? You got a lot of description.
It was very sparse.
Yeah.
A lot of description, pretty sparse dialogue. Yeah.
Exactly. And in the beginning, you're just kind of like, how do you figure out characters if they're not dialoguing, right? Because you're getting this interesting second person narration, and then you're getting a lot of description of this person's, how he became a doctor and what's going on there, but you're not getting a lot of dialogue. So I couldn't really piece relationships together. So when Nisreen got into the plot a bit more, right? Like her identity started coming in. That was interesting. And then other women got introduced. Mira got introduced, and I was like, okay, where is this going to go? But I didn't really feel like I got to know Tariq until I got to know Ali. And that's why the romance between them was heavy for me. Like, it was emotionally heavy. It felt very melancholic. And I think I followed that plot as my favorite or primary plot through the book. How about for you?
So, Rems, when we were talking about this book before the recording, you mentioned that the second half of this book that follows Rafiq, the son, didn't quite do it for you, which I thought was surprising because one of my favorite moments from this book had to do with Rafiq and how he eventually found out that the entire community was aware of his dad's scandal of him being gay in 1980s Cairo. And that he was the only one who didn't know, and that his family kept it away from him, and that he ended up getting in a fight in high school because people were taunting him. And he finally made the connection, like, oh my God, everybody knows something about my dad, but I don't. And it was tragic because it's like his entire community was against him. And the fact that it seemed like the complexity of his father was being thrown onto him completely unfairly, which is something that really hit me with this book, is that the whole situation around Tariq's ostracization was so unfair for everyone, and it affected everyone, and absolutely nobody won from the hatred of homophobia in this case. It just hit hard. It was just a lose-lose for everybody involved. What about you, Karen?
Definitely a lose-lose for everyone involved. And it was a very weighty story. It's interesting to me, though, that Ramya, you didn't find the second part to be as engaging as the first. I found, and maybe this is a function of the narration, I found as though instead of being kind of immersed in the story, I was watching the story from afar. And I didn't find that in the first section that some of the sort of emotional nuances that I might have expected to come out of some of these stories that are being told in the first section, I didn't find them to be there, really. It felt more like it was someone was drawing a portrait rather than living a life in some cases, and that flipped for me once we started to understand more of the dynamics of the women in the relationship, and with the emergence of the identity of the narrator, of the son. Then it became, I'm not sure I'm going to articulate it right, but it became more of a fuller story for me at that point. So I think that the characters of Ali and Tarek were beautifully done, but it felt very much like a second person narration to me. And that's why, one of the reasons why I said earlier I wasn't sure it was going to work. And then it did come together for me in the second part. So it is a book that's really kind of weighing on me. And I think I might want to go back and listen to it again, and pause it in places so I can look up some of the political nuances that are mentioned in it. I did want to say it was incredibly beautifully written and translated. Like the translator, I would love to be able to read it in its first language, because the translator whoever did it was incredible, I think. And, it would be interesting to read it in the original French.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any moment when I was reading the book where I was like, oh, that sounds like a little bit funny in the English, or like there was something a bit odd. It flowed as if it was written in English first. It was really well done.
I did read this book in French because I didn't go to 9 years of public French school for nothing. So I put myself through this. And because it was so beautiful, I did find some quotes from it, but I had to translate it myself. So to give you an idea what a bad translation would sound like, here it goes. These were some of my favorite quotes. These moments had the sweetness of the last log thrown on the fire, each marveling at the warmth it gave off, all the while distancing themselves from any thought of its extinguishment. I really like that one.
That was your translation of the French quote?
Yeah.
Bravo.
Oh my gosh.
Really? Okay.
Really?
I thought I could do better.
Really?
Not to be pretentious, but it was better in French. But we keep going back to the narration,
right?
The second person and first person, then finally it goes to I think that when it starts using us near the end. In the conclusion, it actually ties it in thematically when, well, spoiler alert, Tarek and Rafiq do end up meeting in Boston. You don't really get to hear their conversation, but you see that they walk into the same room and then it ends. But there's a line in there saying, and to who does this scene belong to? Is it to us, to me, or to you? And it's kind of referencing directly in a really meta way the narration. And I thought that was really well done too.
Yeah, I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah. I just want to say that I didn't feel uncomfortable with the arm's length that the author was putting us through when it was second person narration.
Yeah, no problem either. It was the first book I've ever read in second person, and as I was starting it, I rolled my eyes a bit like, oh my god, this is some pretentious second person crap. No, it actually worked out really well. Sorry, Rams, you were gonna say?
Yeah, no, it didn't feel pretentious to me, but it did feel like there were moments in the beginning where I'm like, oh, can I, like you said, Karen, right? Can I get a foothold into this book? Can I feel the investment of me as a reader into this book? But I soon realized, like, you know what? It feels personal. It feels like their story. It feels like we're only getting glimpses of it through time, through snippets, through flash forwards. And I thought that it was impressive how much emotion it evokes, even from the second person. That felt very genuine to me.
I don't know how else you could do this particular story, if not in the second person, to be quite honest with you. If you have this setup of this son who's trying to piece together his father's life, but he wasn't around at that time. He doesn't know anything about that time. He wasn't there. He hasn't heard about it in first person. How else?
Right.
It's so genius, the second person, because he is kind of a voyeur in a sense into that part of his father's life. He's looking back and trying to piece it together. And the second narration gives us that arm's length that he kind of has. So to me, it makes sense where he might have pieces where he's like describing something where he might get that from his grandmother or his aunt, or somebody, something like that, or see a picture of his father from when he was younger and could describe those details. But like the intimacy of moments and things he wouldn't get, because he's just kind of making it up and looking at it from the outside too. Like, it is sheer brilliance. It really is sheer brilliance.
I
that
totally
second
agree.
person narration. Yeah.
The more I digest this book, the more I realize, man, the way Éric Chacour used first person and second person was absolutely brilliant and very thematically complete, right?
Yes.
It was very
makes
concise. It makes a lot of sense to use. It wasn't just because second person sounds cool and literary. Like, there was a reason behind it.
No, it was functional.
Yes.
It was so functional to the story.
I think the structure of the book is really well done, like all the way through. From my perspective, it came together for me at the end rather than being as invested in the beginning of it. So, but I would still recommend this book. I think it was beautifully done.
Maybe it's because I'm a sucker for romance. It was so poetic and so tragic, and I was just like, oh, is this going to work out or not? I don't think so. And that was
what's incredible?
too much for me.
This was Éric Chacour's very first novel.
Oh, my.
Can you believe
Oh
it?
gosh.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
It took him 15 years to write it. Did you know that? He's been writing this. He started writing it when he was 25.
Holy
He's
smokes.
40
I'm
now.
not surprised. I'm not surprised. For such a slim book, there's so much
There
going
Dense. Very
on
dense.
in it.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think really well edited too. There was
Clean,
almost
clean,
no
clean.
filler, just a clean story.
yeah.
It feels like the type of book that would be great for English literature class. Actually, French
Oh,
literature.
absolutely. Because you can dive into like Egypt at that time, like the history and what's happening. That's such a big piece in it as well. There's
The
lots,
metaphors are
lots.
endless, the use of metaphors,
Yeah.
but very quality. But
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. And the language is, I mean, you have to be paying attention because they use, it's probably written at a college level. There were words in the translation that I thought, oh, I need to look it up in
Right.
this dictionary. Yes. Like, it was
Yeah.
beautifully done that way. Just before we go, I just wanted to let readers know that this book's been listed for long listed for the Canada Reads. And it's been on a number of awards lists. And so if that matters to you, pick it up. But if that doesn't matter to you, it's such a beautiful book.
Still pick it up.
yeah, pick it up. It's acclaimed.
Yeah.
It's just a beautiful, beautiful book.
So the book is What I Know About You by Éric Chacour, just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. Karen, Theresa, thank you so much for coming on and recommending this book to us. What a banger.
Thank you.
It's beautiful.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
You too, Rams. Have a good one.
Have a good one.
All right, that's all the time we have for this review of What I Know About You by Éric Chacour. We're wrapping up AMI audiobook review. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you can like and subscribe to the channel. We're also available wherever you listen to podcasts. I was your host, Jacob Chamansky. Have a good one.